In this video, I'm going to go over my expense manager template. And now what this template does is allows you to track your expenses, set up budgets, and if you're able to download transactions in Excel format from your bank credit card statement, easily import those transactions into this template. And so that's what I'm going to start off with. So on sheet 2, I have a sample of what some of these transactions might look like when you download them from your statement. So it's got the transaction date, the description, and the dollar amount. So I'm going to start off by copying the transaction dates. I'm going to go to the Import tab and paste as values. And now I'm going to copy the descriptions and the amounts and paste it here into column C and D. And so now you'll notice in column E for suggested vendor, some of these vendor names have already been autofilled. And the reason being is I've already set those up. So the first time running this, you'll probably need to set up additional vendors to make sure that it's mapping all of them correctly. So in this instance, I have one vendor here, Shell Gas Station, who I have not set up. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to go and hit the setup button, manage vendors, add vendor, and now for vendor name, I'm just going to type Shell Gas Station. The description on the statement, this has to match the text in the description, not entirely, but as long as it finds the words in here. So if I were to just type Shell or just Shell Gas or Shell Gas Station, it would work in this case. But you want to make the text as long as possible to make it as unique as possible. But at the same time, you want to make sure that it's consistent so that it's consistently going to be finding this vendor correctly. And the default category I'm going to set is transportation, and that just means that's the line that it's going to hit initially when I import the expense over. Click Add Vendor, done. And now you'll see that Shell Gas Station is now in the suggested vendor field, auto-filled. Now, employer A, I've got here, now this is an income, not expense. So I'm going to go back to Setup and Manage Income Sources. And here I'm going to start typing employer A. That's because it's a drop down, it'll take a little longer to fill in. I'll select employment income, add new income source. Now it's added. So I have different types of income there, so you can change that through the income categories. Same thing for expense categories if there's different budgets that you want to set up or maintain. Payment sources, what that is, it's got multiple sources here set up, bank, credit card, or savings. And the payment source is just where the transactions or payments are originating from. So this is coming, I'm saying these transactions are coming from my bank statement. So the payment source in this case is the bank. But it could be a credit card, could be savings, could be whatever other account you've got set up. So now that I'm okay with these suggested vendors, I'm going to hit Apply Names. And now all it does is copy it into column B. Now, if one of these vendors was wrong or I had another look and said it's not right, I can click here and change it to one of the vendors that I've already had set up in case it's pulling the wrong one. But now once I'm good with that, I'm going to hit Copy Expenses. And now it's just going to confirm that these are actually coming from my bank statement, which they are. So I'm going to hit Yes. And now it's going to copy the expenses into the All Transactions tab. So now that's done. So now you'll see these are all the transactions that I just copied over. And now you'll notice that it's hitting all the categories, the default categories that were set up. So Shell Gas Station hits transportation, but let's say Walmart, for example. This one shouldn't all be going to eating out, which is probably incorrect. So I'm going to hit Modify Transaction. And next to eating out, I'm going to hit Change. And so I can allocate it to 10 different categories. So I'm going to say spent $20 there on clothing, and I still have $23.21 to allocate, so I'm going to say the rest of that was groceries. But I can keep going into more categories. And now once I hit Update, now the allocation is going to change. Now $20 is hit clothing, 23 for groceries, and then nothing for eating out. So that's the benefit of this template, is you can break out the allocations in 10 different ways. So So it's a lot more complex than just saying, all the transactions from this vendor are hitting this account. So it allows you to be a lot more accurate in your budgeting. Now, in the previous tab, in the import tab, I imported a bunch of transactions over at once, but you can also do it one by one here by clicking the new expense button and selecting, the vendor, the payment source, the amount, the category. And so you can do it all from there. And you can also delete transactions and go back to managing vendors again and go back to that setup menu, the same one as on the import page. And the one thing I didn't mention, I guess before I should mention that the letters in parentheses here for the buttons are the shortcuts. So if I did Control-Shift-T, that'll bring new expense or transaction. Control-Shift-V will bring up vendors, and so on. So the one item I didn't include on here is any sort of transfers between my bank account and, say, my credit card. So if I'm paying off my credit card, because really that's not an expense. It's really a transfer from one account to another. So you don't really need to track this if you want to track your budgets, but if you wanted to do so for the sake of reconciling your accounts and making sure you've got all the transactions accounted for and that all the balances are going to line up, then what you could do is post it as a transfer. And so what I'm going to do to show you is hit the new expense button, and let's say this happened on September 20th. Under type, I'm going to select transfer, and to from, I'm going to say is my credit card. So the source, this is where the transaction originates from. So I'm going to say these are from my bank statement going onto my credit card, and because it's leaving my bank account, I'm going to put a negative $100. For any expense items or any income items, they should always be positive when you import them over. The only exception is if it's a refund from a vendor. Otherwise, they should always be positive. The only time it's not positive or negative is when you're dealing with transfers, and you probably want to do transfers in this to do them manually here at this screen, because it's likely you're not going to be able to map it directly to a description on your statement to say this is definitely coming from this source, because realistically it's not going to give you enough detail to tell you where that payment was going to in most cases. But if it does, then you certainly can. And then what you can do is just set it up as a vendor so it recognizes that it's a payment to that account. But the easier method could be just to do it here from the new transaction page. So here I've got a transfer from the source, being my bank account, to my credit card, and because it's an outflow from my bank, it'll be a negative 100. So I'm going to post that. And now what I'm also going to want to do is post the opposite side of that entry. So in this case, I'm going to select the source as being the credit card, to and from being the bank, and now it's a positive 100 because it's money coming into the credit card. And ultimately the transfers need to balance out to be at zero, and that way you know you've captured them on both sides. Because if you have a transaction on your bank that's leaving $100 going to your credit card, then your credit card is going to have a positive $100 coming into it. So that's one check to make sure that you've got both sides of that accounted for. It's at the end of the month, the transfers should net out to zero. But again, it's not crucial for the purpose of budgeting your expenses, but if you want to make sure all your transactions or all your balances match up, then you can also do that. Now, one quick thing I want to mention about the vendors is you may notice that they're sorted in descending order. And the reason for this is if I go back to Manage Vendors, Modify, the reason for this is if the vendor starts with the same set of letters, it's going to take the longer description first. So, for instance, if I were to have, Shell gas station and just Shell, then Shell gas station is going to show up first instead of Shell. And the benefit being there is it's going to first look at the longest description to find the match for that vendor. Because let's say I created a vendor with just the letter S. The danger if it's in ascending order is it's going to go through, entry by entry on my vendor list, and it's going to first hit vendor S before it would hit Shell or Shell gas station. And by doing so, it's going to say, yep, you found a match for all these vendors. It's vendor S, which is not what you want. Ideally, you want to start off with the longest description first to see, okay, do I find Shell gas station? No. Then I'll move on to the next entry. So that's the benefit of using descending order. It's just a way to sort of mitigate that risk of having a false match. So it may look a little odd, but that's why it's set up the way it is. And now if I move down from the summary, from the chart rather, this shows a summary of my largest expense items on the left-hand side. So in order from the largest expense to the smallest. And then I've also got categories here broken out by their top expenses as well. So I can select multiple categories. Let's say here I wanted to look at transportation. Here I wanted to look at, the utilities. I don't think I had any, no. So groceries, let's say. So this gives you the benefit of having a quick snapshot into your different categories to see, okay, what made up my largest expenses. The other thing you could do is you could go back to the All Transactions tab and just use the filters there if you're comfortable using that. So there's a number of different ways that you could look at the data and summarize it, but the summary tab is intended just to be a good overview of what happened for the month and in what category. And that summarizes my templates. Hope you found it useful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. Thank you. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to let me know. Thank you. So that rounds out the transactions. Now I'm going to show you the reporting side of this. So I'm going to start off with the balances tab. And what this tab shows is just your bank balances. And this goes back to reconciling all your transactions and all your payments to and from any account. And so on line 17, you would enter your opening balance. And then subsequently, it's going to track your balance based on the transactions that you've posted. So it's going to default in starting from January, but it will track any changes accordingly based on the transaction that you've posted. So ideally, you'd be able to match up and say, okay, this is the balance on my bank. This should match up to what I have on my actual physical statements. Now, the one difficulty is with credit card statements especially, is they usually have a cutoff not right at the end of the month. So it'll make it a little bit not as smooth in that case, but you can still reconcile up until that date. So that's balances. It really doesn't have any other purpose than that. It's just to make sure that you've got everything posted and everything matches up nicely. And then next up, I'll show you the cash flow page. And what this shows is your spending by categories. So here I've got my budget set up. I've got transportation, utilities, and within this budget, I can assign it different budget categories. So for instance, I've broken it between essential expenses, discretionary expenses, and one-time expenses. But let's say you didn't want to break it out like that. If I go back to, say, the All Transactions page, hit Setup, Manage Expense Categories, here I'll find all my different budgets that I've set up. So clothing, I've marked it discretionary. I can change it to whatever else. Same thing for groceries here. So I can make a new category. What I can also do is modify these budget categories. So I've got essential, discretionary, one-time expenses. I can change these to whatever else, and they'll update on my cash flow tab. And then what I'd want to do is just reclassify my expense categories, my budget categories here. And so that fuels this. So under essential, I've only put transportation and utilities, or discretionary, I've got a bit more here. And so what it does, it'll track my spending month over month, provide an average, show my budget as well. And so if I'm over budget, it'll highlight it in red. So here, electronics. September I spent $78. I budgeted only $50. So the benefit of breaking down the categories, you can track it different ways, report on it different ways. And here, transfers, they net out to zero. So if I didn't post the other side of that transfer onto my credit card, then it would be an amount in here other than zero. So that's the benefit of that, is making sure that you've got everything accounted for. So if I go to the per dollar spending, it's the exact same thing, except now as almost a reflection of the cash you received. So for instance, for every dollar you receive, spent a penny on essential expenses, 3 pennies on discretionary. So it works almost like on a percentage base to give you an idea of what fraction of a dollar you're spending where. So it's just a different way to show the same type of information. And then lastly, I've got the summary tab here. So the summary tab, it shows a summary basically of my expenses by month and by category. So for instance, here I got September 2016, my budget was $875, total spent was $209, remaining $665. And it shows all my categories. And so for instance, for clothing here, if I hover over, it says $20 was my actual, and I've got a remaining amount of $80. So here it shows $20 spent. So the dark green is the portion I've used. The light green is what I've got left over. In the case of electronics, the dark green shows my total budget. So this tells me it was $50, but I incurred $78.53. So this red portion indicates how much I was over budget by. So here you get a snapshot of how you were reflective of your different expense categories. Now I can change this to say, look, I just want to look at essential expenses as my budget category. And so because I've only got 2, this is going to look a lot different than if I were to look at all of them, or let's say discretionary expenses. So now you can see it just shows the discretionary expenses. So that's the benefit of tracking it this way, is you get a way to look at it differently, especially if you have a lot of different categories. But if you only have a handful, I've only got about a half a dozen or here. So if I set it to all, then it's not going to be too cumbersome to go through. But it just gives you a way to sort of review and see on a different scale what your budget looks like. And now if I move down from the summary, from the chart rather, this shows a summary of my largest expense items on the left-hand side. So in order from the largest expense to the smallest. And then I've also got categories here broken out by their top expenses as well. So I can select multiple categories. Let's say here I wanted to look at transportation. Here I wanted to look at, the utilities. I don't think I had any, no. So groceries, let's say. So this gives you the benefit of having a quick snapshot into your different categories to see, okay, what made up my largest expenses. The other thing you could do is you could go back to the All Transactions tab and just use the filters there if you're comfortable using that. So there's a number of different ways that you could look at the data and summarize it, but the summary tab is intended just to be a good overview of what happened for the month and in what category. And that summarizes my template. Hope you found it useful. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.